Eva, good morning and welcome. You've spent much of the past 2 decades reporting from foreign wars and conflicts. Was this something you had ever imagined yourself doing when you were still at high school?
No, absolutely not. I was completely apolitical when I was in high school. My family, my parents were musicians. They were fairly apolitical as well. I grew up surrounded by music, and anything political was a foreign concept to me. I was extremely naive. I was extremely uninformed, and I certainly had no aspirations to get into anything geopolitical or journalistic.
Uninformed. You grew up in Canada, correct?
I did. I was born in the States, in the
Okay.
US, and around age 3, my family moved to Canada.
What's the most dangerous place you've reported from, and do you feel more vulnerable as a woman?
Well, I've reported from several dangerous places, Gaza, Syria, and Donbas, in all of which I've been exposed to live fire. Okay, I should clarify. In Gaza, I was accompanying farmers and fishers. And this might sound strange to your listeners and your viewers, but literally when Palestinian farmers go to work on their farmland, they are at risk of Israeli soldiers gunning them down and killing them. And this happens on a near daily basis. So I was an activist at the time. This was from the years late 2008 to mid 2013. I lived in Gaza for a period of 3 years between that space, so a year and a half, and then I left Gaza and I came back, and I left and came back. So during that time, I was accompanying farmers and also fishers at the first until it became too dangerous. And basically, what happens, if I may expand on this, is that they go on their farmland and they're like 500, 600 or more meters from the fence that encircles Gaza. And the Israeli soldiers arrive in jeeps and assume position and start firing at them. And just to be clear, this land, it's the most fertile land in Gaza. It was the breadbasket, the agricultural region of Gaza.
I
I'm
see.
talking about the band on the north and east of Gaza, which is a very tiny strip of land to begin with. And it's been bulldozed and razed over the years by the Israelis. So,
Hmm.
what was once an area flourishing with all sorts of trees is now almost a barren wasteland that Palestinians are trying to farm in.
Wow.
So there's no excuse for the Israelis to be gunning them down. They can see clearly who they're shooting at. And who they're shooting at are young men working as farm laborers, families, including elderly grandparents and children working on their land, and also women working as farm laborers. So over the course of the 3 years I spent there, I accompanied farmers and routinely came under live fire with bullets literally whizzing past my head and body. So
Wow.
there's that. I was also in Gaza during two Israeli wars on Gaza. So the first one being 2008, 2009, December, January, and I was not like most foreign journalists in a hotel. I was riding in ambulances in the most dangerous areas of Gaza, so
Yeah.
exposed to the Israeli F-16s, Apaches, drones, and shelling.
Wow.
And also, I was in an ambulance that came under Israeli sniper fire during supposed ceasefire hours.
Hmm.
So that's Gaza. Also
Wow.
in
Wow.
Syria, I've been going to Syria since 2014.
Yeah.
It was I went there to find out. In all cases, when I go to somewhere, it's to find out for myself as much as I can, as best as I can.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert. I never professed to be one, but I try my utmost to learn from the people in the
Yeah.
places I go to. In Syria, I started going there in 2014. It was extremely dangerous then. Even in the capital, Damascus, most people don't realize this, but it was being shelled on a near daily basis by terrorists, which at the time the Western media was calling rebels,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
a kilometer away in eastern Ghouta.
Yeah.
So there was that. I also in what year was it? In 2014, I was outside the walls of the old city of Damascus, and
Mhm.
I was just resting alongside the wall. It was summer. It was hot. I was in the shade, and a sniper fire from eastern Ghouta was fired towards me and other people who were in that region.
Yeah.
I
Wow.
was used to being fired at from being in Gaza, but I wasn't expecting that.
Wow.
And other times I was in close proximity to Al Qaeda, Aleppo, Dara, other areas of Syria. in order to report on issues I deemed important, I had to expose myself to potential sniper fire.
Yeah.
And in the Donbas, I went there in 2019, again, to talk with civilians and hear their side of the story.
Yeah.
And these were civilians living in homes that were being assaulted by the Ukrainian forces. And these homes were 500 meters from the Ukrainians.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Eva, as a sort of follow-up, do you need to be an especially brave, or some would even say foolish person, to put yourself in harm's way for the sake of covering a story? Do you consider yourself?
That's a hard question. I tend to deflect when it comes to like people saying brave or whatever. It's something you get accustomed to. I remember, I'm sorry if this is too much information for your listeners, but I remember the first time I saw a dead Palestinian during the Israeli assault on Gaza in 2008-9. And I started, of course, like any normal person, crying. And the medics I was with, one of them, a really lovely man, he was a volunteer medic, he was a high school teacher. Really, he was brave. These medics are brave. I'm just somebody who got into this. But he told me, Eva, if you're going to do this, you cannot cry. And he wasn't being mean. He was just saying, like, matter of fact, just like a doctor, they have to compartmentalize their feelings. So anyway, my point with that is it's something you get accustomed to, I guess, like emergency workers do.
Sure.
I don't consider myself brave. I consider the people living in these areas and facing it all the time. Those are the brave ones.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I suppose there's an element of, I don't know if it's foolish. Some people might say it's foolish. I think it's become personal for me. This is not about career, or it's certainly not about money, because I pour more money into going to these places than I ever earn. Although I am very grateful to those who support me, and I do have good supporters, of course, non-government supporters. But it is personal because, I've met people, I've in many cases been invited into their homes, and it becomes personal. You cannot be neutral. This whole myth of neutrality as a journalist is bogus. You can't be neutral when you see these things. It has to, if you're a human being with a beating heart, it's personal.
Yeah, I can understand that. Eva, you've seen a lot of suffering and death, and a question I also had for you was, how do you recover, personally? Most of us, young people especially, might say, well, how on earth can you see that and then continue? Do you have any techniques or mechanisms to distract yourself and get back on a normal footing?
I think that I've done a lot of public speaking, and I think that's been a kind of therapy, writing and speaking about the crimes and the horrors that I've seen. I mean, of course, there are elements of PTSD. I won't lie about that,
Okay.
But I think sharing my experiences and doing what I can to inform others has been very helpful to me. Like it just, if you're doing this kind of work, you are going to be somewhat emotionally injured, to put it mildly. But we're all human beings, and I deal with it the best I can.
Okay, so writing and communicating has been therapeutic also, as well as informative for readers.
Yeah.
Eva, I wanted to ask you the difference between a freelance independent reporter like yourself and someone from what we call the MSM, the mainstream media. I'm thinking more in practical terms. You mentioned that you were on the ground, you pay your own expenses to report from these places, you put yourself in harm's way. How did you see yourself compared to those from BBC or wherever, particularly in Syria, I'm thinking?
Yeah, so I have encountered journalists from BBC, Canadian Broadcasting, CBC, and other corporate media outlets. I've encountered them in Syria. And I will say I need to illustrate one occasion in 2014. Terrorist factions in eastern Ghouta were shelling Damascus, as I mentioned earlier. And on this occasion, they shelled a school, the Manar Elementary School in Old Damascus, the old city of Damascus. And that shelling killed one child and injured over 60. And so I went to, there's a hospital called the French Hospital, excuse me, and I went there to see the victims and to try to document, the fact. I mean, it's not easy, to be honest. It's not easy to put a camera in the face of a child who's been injured by this shelling, but I think it is necessary to show a counter to what the media is saying. So I was doing that, and I saw Lise Doucet, a Canadian journalist who's with the BBC, and she was there in the French hospital. And there was a Syrian woman asking her, are you going to tell the truth about what's happened today? You've seen these victims, you've seen these children. Are you going to tell the truth? And she nodded her head and said yes. And she went on to write an article where she said something to the effect that the quote unquote regime, the Syrian government, claims it's terrorist. I think she put that in quotations, but locals believe it's the regime, quote. And I put regime in quote because it's the Syrian government. Anyway, it was so disingenuous because everybody knew where those mortars were coming from. You don't have to be a military expert to know they're coming from your neighbors in Ghouta. And she knew that, and she was just lying. She was just lying. And so I say this because this happens routinely. These journalists go to Syria or wherever, and they have, I'm assuming they have their expenses paid, all the logistics taken care of for them. And then they have a team to do the research, the translation, the editing, everything.
Okay.
And I didn't really realize this until a couple of years ago. I was in Western Canada, and I met with a Facebook friend who used to be, I think he was a producer for some Canadian media corporation. And he said to me, Eva, did you realize that, number one, these journalists are earning six figures, and when they go somewhere, everything is done for them. And I hadn't really thought about that because, for people who don't know, when I go to Syria or anywhere, it starts with me acquiring the visa, which is a timely process. It's not handed out on a golden platter.
No.
And of course I pay for it. And then it's, all the logistics people don't even consider, finding the cheapest plane ticket, which usually involved multiple layovers. And then getting to Syria, which involved like taking a shared taxi where I'd have to wait an hour or two for it to fill up before it actually went to Syria, finding a cheap hotel, and then all the logistics on the ground, and then doing the interviews. And I do speak local Arabic, but I always strive for perfection when possible. So when I do the interviews, then I send them to a friend who will translate into very accurate English, so I don't misrepresent the people I've interviewed.
Right.
And then I do the subtitling of the videos when necessary, or when I publish videos. So all that I do myself. Vanessa Beeley, my friend and colleague, does herself. And these journalists, they have teams of people, and they still intentionally get it wrong.
Wow, incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible. That seems to be a pattern of misreporting. Well, we know that in Scotland. I'm Scottish, and we saw the BBC at work in 2014 when we had a very famous or infamous independence referendum where the BBC was totally on side with fabricating all sorts of stories. But that's another issue completely. Eva, almost 1 year ago to the day, you wrote, 7 years after the Maidan Revolution of 2014, after the Maidan Revolution divided the country, Ukraine intensifies its shelling of Donbas to the sound of deafening silence from the Western media. We hear a lot about Donbas, Donetsk, Lugansk. Can you just give a quick picture of what we're talking about here?
Yeah. So, and as I said to you before you started recording, I just want to make clear to people, I'm not an expert on matters Ukraine and Russia, and I don't pretend to be, but I do have experience in the Donbas, and I am constantly researching and learning and trying to inform myself and inform others. So without getting too bogged down into fine details, in 2014, there was a coup in Ukraine. A puppet government was installed. It was a bloody affair. The Maidan was extremely bloody. There were massacres of Ukrainian civilians by Ukrainian forces and by actors presumably on the payroll of the West. There was the massacre in Odessa, a trade union house, if I recall, and people were burned alive. They were executed. They were strangled. It was a horrific massacre that I don't believe got much play in Western media, and certainly isn't mentioned now when all the media is talking about Ukraine, when all social media are putting their profile photos into the Ukrainian flag and hashtagging I stand with Ukraine. None of this is mentioned, nor is the 8 years of Ukrainian shelling of the people of the Donbas. So the people of the Donbas, my understanding from having gone there and spoken with them and researching, is that when they saw what was happening in Kiev and in Odessa, they said, okay, wait, we're ethnic Russians. They wanted like people in Crimea are ethnic Russians, they wanted to be able to speak their language and have that taught in school. And they did not agree with the neo-Nazis' policy of rewriting history and glorifying Nazis and trashing, the defeat of Nazism, the Soviet defeat of Nazism, which is happening, which has been happening, continues to happen, this rewriting history. So these people didn't want any of that. They wanted to be, at first they just wanted to be away from it, and then they wanted autonomy from Ukraine. And in response, Ukraine unleashed a torrent. I was going to curse, I'm sorry. They unleashed a torrent of bombardment on the people of Donbas for the last 8 years. To be clear, when this started, I was in Syria, and I was pretty tunnel visioned on what I was seeing in Syria, because it was also a horrific situation. So I won't pretend that I was, I was informed to a degree, but I wasn't extremely focused on what was happening there. But I was at least aware. But in 2019, I finally had the opportunity to go to the Donbas, again, at my own expense. I have to stress that, because people make all these assumptions about my motivations, and my motivations are always to inform myself and others as best I can. So I spent just under 3 weeks in the Donbas, in the Donetsk People's Republic, and I went to areas, there's a city north of Donetsk called Gorlivka. I went to areas around that, which were 500, 600, 400 meters from the Ukrainian forces, and which were being shelled on a daily, nightly basis. Ukraine, so in 2014 and 15, there were, I believe there were two treaties, Minsk agreements, which meant, there was supposed to be a truce, and both sides were not supposed to use heavy weapons. Ukraine has systematically violated those agreements since then. They've been using heavy weapons, and none of the international bodies that are supposed to hold Ukraine accountable do anything, just like they don't hold Israel accountable for its systematic violations against the Palestinians. And so these people that I were meeting, they were like our grandmothers, our grandfathers. They were elderly people who had nowhere to go. Some wouldn't leave because this is their home, and why would I leave? And others just had nowhere to go. These are impoverished people who are scraping by, and they're being terrorized on a daily, nightly basis by the Ukrainian shelling and machine gun fire. I met a man in a town. It was called Krutaya Balka. You can look that up if you want. But anyway, in this town, I first encountered an elderly married couple who again, they had nowhere to go. Their house would have been destroyed if they hadn't been home when it came under Ukrainian heavy machine gun fire, and the roof caught on fire, and they were able to exterminate the fire. But if they hadn't been home, their house would have gone up in flames, as many others in the region have. And then I met a man who was walking down a lane. So I have to say, this is the only time I've ever worn body armor, a flak, a vest. That was provided to me, and I'm extremely grateful for that. That and a helmet by the DPR press office, which accompanied me in those regions.
I should just say the DPR. I should just say the DPR is
Donetsk People's Republic.
People's Republic, yeah. Now, at the moment, Eva, I just wanted to come back to that. Geographically talking now, if we look at it, we're talking about southeast Ukraine. The Donbas is the total region, and there are two republics. Is that correct? Donetsk.
That's correct, and the Donbas actually does extend into Ukraine also, not just like the republics, which I didn't realize at first. It's a bit confusing, but it is a region which includes the two republics.
I see. Okay, I just wanted to get that clear as you were.
And of course that borders with Russia.
Okay, and people have been basically living in basements for 8 years because of this shelling, which we have now learned.
I met an elderly couple who I did film, but they didn't want their faces filmed because I think they feared reprisal from Ukraine. And that was actually the case with many people I met. They didn't want to be on camera because they feared Ukraine attacking them. Well, Ukraine is already attacking them. But anyway, one man told me, this man I was going to say about in Krutaya Balka, he was walking to his home and he had to walk down a lane that was exposed to Ukrainian sniper fire. He agreed to have me record him audio but he would not have his face recorded because he has to walk down that road, and he just feared that the Ukrainian intelligence would come across the interview and decide to take it out on him. And he said, according to him, he alleged he'd already been sniped once in the leg. But I asked why he remained in his home, and he said he had nowhere to go. And he also said he thought the war would be over, but it went on and on. But in that region, I also met an elderly couple that were living in the basement of a school, and they'd been there, I think, for 6 years at the time that I met them in 2019, because their house had been destroyed.
Wow, it's incredible. And we have heard almost nothing of this conflict and we still don't hear about it, but we have heard a great deal in the past 8 days. But not much about the last 8 years.
Exactly.
Eva, this awful conflict has spread across Ukraine now after Russia's military intervention. The West says that Russia has started a war. Russia says that it's trying to end an already ongoing war. Russia is attempting to bring the problems in the East to an end. That is the justification.
So I want to cite, with a caveat, from former Ukrainian Prime Minister Mykola Azarov. Yeah. And again, I'm not familiar with this man, but his post was shared by a source that I trust, and this person doesn't generally share, propaganda or information that's not accurate. So, but I will put that caveat out there that I cannot myself confirm. But anyway, his post said, as of December 2021, Russia received data on NATO plans to place 4 military brigades in Ukraine, an air brigade with the possibility of carrying nuclear warheads. NATO troops wanted to agree on this introduction in the summer of 2022 at a UN meeting. Blah, blah, blah. Let's see. They would provoke a conflict and start a full-scale war against Russia. In any case, this aligns with something I heard yesterday. I attended a lecture yesterday by a very informed political analyst, Russian political analyst, and he was talking about the fact that Russia. Now, I haven't had a chance to listen to the audio because this lecture was yesterday and I got home quite late last night. But essentially, if I remember correctly, he was saying that when Russia launched the military operation into Ukraine, it was just hours before Ukraine would have started an operation against the Donbas to isolate it from Russia. And this would have obviously been a major threat to not only the people of the Donbas, but to Russia. Okay. So, it's being framed by Western media as an aggression and invasion. I would like to know some differences between American aggressions and invasions and Israeli invasions and aggressions. Israel invades Gaza on a daily basis. People don't realize this, but it's constantly invading Gaza and bulldozing homes, in addition to bulldozing lands and targeting Palestinians. America, I'm sure your viewers and your listeners would know, has waged wars of aggression against so many countries we can't even list here. We're aware of the main ones like Serbia, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Yemen is being bombarded by Saudi Arabia, and nobody talks about that. But, when America wages their invasions, they decimate everything. And my understanding from the research I've been doing and from political analysts like Scott Ritter, who's a former weapons inspector, American weapons inspector, and also the Duran Alex Cristoforio, I think his name is, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, is that Russia's military operation has been very strategic. It's been taking out Ukrainian military installations. And it hasn't been carpet bombing like America does, civilian infrastructure and civilians. And in fact, from what I'm seeing, it seems that Russia is, when it comes near a civilian area, it's giving notice to civilians to flee the area. Now, I don't want people to misinterpret that as that it's doing what Israel does. And what Israel does is it sends a drone if the people get any advance warning, which in most cases they don't. But if they get any advance warning, it's a drone strike on their house before Israel F-16s the house. That's not what Russia is doing. Russia is deliberately not targeting civilian infrastructure. And a point that Alex made in one of his videos, which I would highly encourage people to listen to, Alex Cristoforio, I think, is that whereas America, when they invaded Iraq, they took down the internet, they took down, all the
Yeah.
infrastructure, water,
Yeah.
electricity, et cetera. Russia's
Yeah.
not doing that.
No. No.
And actually, things would be faster if Russia did do that, apparently. But they're moving quickly, but they're also, in a
Yeah.
sense, moving slower than they could move because they're
Yeah.
not doing that.
Yeah.
So, the media is framing it as this whole scale invasion. Like you mentioned, they're not mentioning at all the 8 years of Ukrainian war against the Donbas.
Yeah.
And they're also not mentioning Ukrainians have been living under this neo-Nazi rule, and it's not a pretty picture. Civilians have been executed, tortured, imprisoned. Journalists are imprisoned, tortured, executed. In 2019, I met a Ukrainian journalist. He was the editor of RIA Novosti in Ukraine, Kirill Vyshinsky.
Okay.
He was imprisoned on ridiculously false accusations of treason and a threat to Ukrainian national security, because he published 14 or 15 articles, opinion articles, none of which were written by him. And they had differing opinions on the situation of events around the Maidan. Sure. He was just publishing as an editor these opinion articles. Yeah. 4 years later, Ukraine arrests him and says he's a threat to their security for having published those articles, none of which he wrote. Yeah, and he was kept for, I forget the time, I feel like it was a year and a half. In horrible conditions. He was tortured. I interviewed him, and he downplayed. He's a very humble man. He didn't get into how much he was tortured, but he was tortured. Okay. And the people he was with were tortured. And he has colleagues that were assassinated. So none of our media is talking about this. Their crocodile tears for the people of Ukraine is completely disingenuous again. They don't care about the people of Ukraine. If they did, they wouldn't have supported these neo-Nazis.
No. On that same topic, Eva, is it true that your name appears on a hit list of journalists who are being targeted by the regime in Kiev?
I'm on a list. I wrote about it because I figured people should know that this exists, this democratic ally of Western nations. Okay. So basically, and ironically, the name translates to peacekeepers. This website, yes. Peacemaker. Sorry. Yeah. So essentially, anybody who shows any sort of like honest reporting towards not only the Donbas, but also it could be simply like you've said, hey, Crimeans chose to return to Russia. They weren't invaded, and it wasn't an occupation. They actually are ethnic Russians, and they wanted to become a part of Russia because life under Ukraine was horrible. So even if you do that, that crime, you could be put on this hit list. But it's not a trifling matter, because they actually, when they have the information, they will publish your address, your phone number, your passport details. And I'm just going to look at my article, because I was citing another article. I was citing a report by the Foundation for the Study of Democracy. The report is called Ukrainian War Crimes and Human Rights Violations, 2017 to 2020. And it noted a Ukrainian journalist who was assassinated in 2015 after his personal details were published on the website. And it said, quote, a few days before his death, Oles Busina's details, including his home address, were posted on the Canadian-based Muratvoret's website. And according to many experts, it was the listing on the site and the publication of his home address that prompted the murder of him. And it goes on to say there are other people that have been murdered as a result of their name being on this website and their information being published. And Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has basically said, well, we're not going to interfere. We don't want to interfere with free speech. So we're not going to do anything to have this website taken down that's calling for the assassination of people like me.
Wow. Okay. And this is the same Ukraine that we in the West want to fast track into the European Union immediately. That could meet some roadblocks on the way. Eva, is our problem in the West that we suffer from selective outrage?
Absolutely.
We just let some things. We have a blindfold for some things.
Yeah, it's a media marketing campaign, and people who are changing their profile pics on Facebook to the Ukrainian flag and hashtagging I stand with Ukraine, I'm sure they are good people. I'm sure they've been given this soundbite or this bit of information and told, this is horrible what's happening. You must show your empathy with them. And they're thinking, okay, I show my empathy with them.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily blame them for being naive and gullible and doing that, because they're not being given the whole picture. I wrote this article I think in January 2016, and I had just been to a district of Beirut, which had suffered a multiple suicide bomber attack, killing, I forget the number of civilians. I want to say dozens. It was pretty horrific. And then I'd been to an area of Syria, Al-Zahra Homs, which also had been plagued with terrorist attacks, car bombings, suicide bombings. And I had been there, I believe I went there 2 days after the attack. So there was literally still blood on the walls of the homes, and people were still in shock and grief and wailing, in grief at the loss of their family. And I spent time with these people, and I listened to the family members talk about the attacks, and of course there's nothing in the media about it. Or if there was, I have to point out how disgusting the media, and this applies to Ukraine as well, how disgusting the media is. Because what they did was they said, well, Al-Zahra is an Alawi area, and Alawi supports the regime, so their lives don't matter. But you know what? It wasn't just an Alawi area. It's also an area, Alawi, by the way, if your listeners aren't aware, and I wasn't aware until some years ago, Alawi is a sect. It's a religious sect, like Sunni Islam, like Shia Islam, like Christianity. In Beirut, the area that was targeted, the media said, well, these were Hezbollah supporters. These were Shias. That doesn't matter, And it's so disgusting, because number one, even if they were exclusively Shia and Alawi, they're human beings. They're civilians. But number two, both these areas were actually mixed areas. In Al-Zahra, it had Christians, it had Sunnis. And in Burj Barajni in Beirut, it had also Sunnis, it had Christians. So, it was a disgusting tool by the media. And then with regard to Ukraine, I've seen reports being shared, how people find, I really can't stomach watching MSM. I have to understand what they're saying. But anyway, people beat me to it. And so they've got these clips of MSM talking about Ukraine and actually saying something to the effect of, well, Ukraine is civilized. It's not like Afghanistan. It's not like Iraq. It's not like Libya. It's civilized. It's white. It's Christian. Like, that's disgusting. And by the way, Syria is the birthplace of Christianity, and Syrian Christians have been terrorized for years. But let's not. So there you go. Selective outrage, and this is, unfortunately, is being programmed to the public. Again, I don't blame the public. Most people are struggling to get by. Most people don't have time to really consume media like we do, and they're being given these sound bites, and they're jumping in the bandwagon. But for those in media, particularly those who depict themselves as independent, anti-imperialist, or what have you, who are sitting on the fence, I condemn. Because there are many in Western media who were late to the game on Syria, who not only were late to the game on Syria, but who spewed the same propaganda emanating from Western media. They spewed it for years. And then late at the end, 2017, 2018, they started to say, okay, this is a foreign war on Syria. Before that, they were saying Assad regime, war crimes. And they're doing the same thing here. They're like, I don't support any war. I just want peace. Okay, that's great. You know what? You want peace? Well, the people of Donbas want peace. And they haven't had peace for 8 years. So before you say, I condemn Russia and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, shed a tear or two and talk about the people of Donbas who've been maimed and killed and terrorized for 8 years. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Eva, in Russia itself, now you're based at the moment, you're in Russia somewhere?
Yeah.
Okay, so how do you sense that, has there been surprise in Russia at the level of, what you could say, outrage from abroad? After all, Western countries, as you mentioned, particularly those who are members of NATO, take military action against whoever they like, whoever they accuse of breaking international law. But is there a sense of surprise in Russia?
No, I wouldn't say surprise. No, I
Mm,
mean Russians have been vilified,
okay.
for how long?
Okay.
No,
Yeah.
I would say like the reaction is expected.
Okay. Um,
Yeah.
there have been reports of protests and video. How large do you sense that is, and are they forbidden in any way?
I don't have a sense of how large. I haven't been following the protest issue.
Yeah.
I'm in One reason I haven't been is in my experience, protests in Russia are usually fanned by the West.
Hmm.
When I say that, I mean, for example, when I came here in 2019, I came here for my first time in August 2019. At that time, there were protests in Moscow. I think something to do with elections, mayor elections or something, if I
Yeah.
remember.
Yeah.
And I remember, I'm sorry to elaborate on this, but I'm making a point here. I remember Western media was talking a lot about police brutality, and so I thought, okay, I'm going to go bear witness, and I didn't see any police brutality. I saw actually remarkably restrained police,
Yeah.
particularly given I have experience in protests in the West and Palestine, and of course we know how protests have unfolded in France and the brutality the Yellow Vests have been met with. So what I saw was actually a very restrained police force.
Okay.
There was an unsanctioned protest. So, like in the West, people have to have permission to protest.
Yeah.
Crazy, but it's the
Yeah.
same in the West, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
at the unsanctioned protest that followed the sanctioned protest, I did see people being taken away, but they were literally being led away like a young child. They
Sure.
were not being.
Sure.
There were cases in last year. There were protests around Navalny, which is another charade fanned by the West. And of course, you will see scenes of people being hit with batons,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
what you don't see is before that people rushing the police and attacking them.
Yeah.
And I actually
Yeah.
saw footage and I slowed it down and I saw this one guy rushing and headbutting the police, another guy rushing and kicking the police,
Yeah.
and they were met with batons. So anyway, I say that to make a point that in my experience, these sorts of protests have been encouraged by the West. For example, I think it was the US State Department on Twitter. I think it was that account, or the US Embassy. I can't remember. Maybe the US Embassy in Russia, tweeting the protest locations for the Navalny protest last year, or
Okay.
2021. And I believe they did similar in 2019. So, and then just in my experience, when I attended these protests, unlike protests I've gone to in Venezuela, in Palestine, in Canada, where people are passionate and informed about what they're protesting, the people I saw at these protests were apathetic and seemingly uninformed. So it seemed to me that they were there because they'd been called to be there, not because they genuinely believed in what they were protesting. So for that reason, anything to do with protest over Ukraine, I guess I've already been programmed to disregard protests in Russia.
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, there were horrendous scenes in Spain against after the independence referendum in Catalonia. Horrendous scenes of unprovoked violence from the police, and we've seen, as you mentioned, we've seen the same in Paris and other parts of France. A few brief questions to close off with, Eva.
Can I
Eva,
just
by
make
the way,
one point before you do? Sorry.
yeah,
In Canada, the Freedom Convoy, the truckers, that were protesting nonviolently, that are terrorists of a prime minister, I must say, and Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, whose grandfather was a Nazi collaborator, in Canada, who supports the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. I'm sorry, I just have to make this point. They
I'm sorry. Who was that? Who was the one with the
Sorry,
Nazi
yeah. So
heritage? That
Chrystia Freeland,
went very quick.
sorry, Chrystia Freeland is the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada.
Okay.
Her grandfather was a collaborator with the Nazis,
Wow.
and Canada is very supportive of the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. I have a number of links I could send to you if you like.
Wow.
In any case, there was if people are following events around protesting COVID vaccine mandates in Canada, there was a trucker convoy. I'm sure everybody's heard about this. That eventually merged in Ottawa, the capital of Canada.
Right.
And they were protesting nonviolently against a very violent mandate of forced vaccination. And corporate media depicted them as terrorists and right-wing and Nazis, ironically. But at one of the protests, I forget the date, I'm pretty sure it was in Ottawa, maybe Toronto, I might be wrong. And a woman in a mobility chair was trampled by a mounted police horse, mounted police on a horse. She was trampled by.
Sure. Yeah.
So this was intentional. We're talking about violence against protesters. This is a woman is a disabled woman that was trampled by Canadian forces.
Okay.
So.
Is that situation still ongoing in Canada? Has the trucker convoy continued?
To be honest, I'm not sure. I'm sorry. My attention has been pretty focused on events here.
Okay. Just an aside.
Yeah.
Eva, and I hope I'm getting your name right because I've said it Eva all the way through.
You're actually one of the only people that says it the way I grew up, but I'm okay with Eva, which my dear friend Vanessa always says, and here in Russia it's Eva. So
I'm having to really bite my tongue all the time because where I live in Denmark, no one's called Eva; they're called Eva. So
yeah.
But I think I heard once that your actual name is Eva. Anyway, I think I tried. If I was wrong, I was consistently wrong. So
you were right. Actually.
Okay. Eva, I don't know how much you could answer this at the moment, but do you think the West's sanctions on Russia will work? I can't remember any sanctions like this on any nation in my lifetime, covering the media, covering every aspect of life, even cat shows. People can't exhibit their Russian cats. It's
ridiculous. It's actually absurd. Was it in Italy? They removed Dostoevsky from university curriculum or something crazy like that. I mean, it's absurd. If anything, these sanctions and these removals should show how absurd the West is behaving right now.
But will these sanctions work? Do you think? Are they biting? Do you think so?
It depends. What do we mean by work, though? Like, will it stop Russia from its intent to denazify Ukraine? And
I think that's the West's justification for this attempt.
Yeah. No. From what I understand, and again, I'm no geopolitical analyst, but from what I understand, people should bear in mind that this Ukrainian shelling of Donbas, as we said, has been going on for 8 years, and Russia did not invade. Although if you were to type Russia invade Ukraine and do a time like a search where you select for example from years 2019 to 2021, you will find headlines of this. The West has been predicting Russia invading Ukraine for years, but it hasn't happened until now. And this analyst whose lecture I attended yesterday made the point that that Putin waited until there was no option but to do this military campaign. And I think that's a point that obviously we're not going to hear in Western media because they've depicted, I don't know if your listeners are aware, but Western media works hand in hand with Western governments. So for the last decade, they've vilified the president of Syria, depicting him in very cartoonish ways as a monster who eats babies for breakfast, right? And gasses his own people. He's actually quite beloved in Syria. And you would not know that the way media depicts him. But he's seen in Syria as a protector of the people, as a mild-mannered doctor, as a humble person that walks amongst the people. And Putin, I don't know the degree of respect because I'm still fairly new here, but he and everything to do with Russia are vilified to an extreme in Western media, and they have to be for media to push their lies and propaganda. So back to the question of whether sanctions will work. My understanding from my research and from this lecture I attended yesterday, when Russia took the decision to do this military operation to eradicate these Nazi elements in Ukraine and restore stability for the Ukrainian people to set up their own future, that's a decision that's going to continue until it's finished. So sanctions or no sanctions, it will continue. That's my understanding.
Okay.
Sanctions will hurt the Russian people, of course,
Yes.
just like
Yes.
they're extremely, is an understatement, hurting the Syrian people. You know, the U.S. is the West. The U.S. has and allies have put so many sanctions on the Syrian people.
Mm.
It's the cost of living. The inflation is out of control in Syria. People can't afford cooking gas. You
Wow.
know, and it's you won't hear. I would highly encourage people to watch Vanessa Beeley's interviews and read her writings. I've written about the
Mm.
issue of sanctions, but she's living there.
Yeah.
She can talk at great length about the impact of the sanctions on the Syrian people. They don't hurt the government.
Mm.
One good thing about sanctions that the analyst I listened to yesterday pointed out is that it's going to hurt the oligarchs.
Okay.
So that's an interesting point.
Yeah. Yeah.
But as in terms of stopping the military operation, my understanding is no.
No. Okay. They've set a course and they're going to stick to it. If I have to ask you, we're seeing a lot of media being banned and censored by the West. How are the media outlets in Russia faring? Has there been any clampdown on local media, or is there relative freedom to speak out?
I don't actually know the answer to that. I know I was talking with a fellow journalist yesterday at this lecture I attended. I think one outlet is closed, but
Mm.
I believe it was because it's clear they're receiving funding from the West.
Mm.
But I know when I came here in 2019 and I was talking with expats who've lived here for a decade or 15 or 20 years, they were all making the point like, you know, the West talks about censorship in Russia, but there are so many uh, outlets, opposition outlets, that are openly anti-Putin in Russia,
Yeah.
that operate and promote, you know, write their propaganda and their lies and whatever their views that are anti-Putin, pro-Navalny, pro-West, and they operate and they function. They continue to function. I mean, I can think of one, the Moscow Times. It's still operating.
Yeah.
I'm not intimately familiar with Russian media. I really need to change that
Yeah.
as
Okay.
I need to
Okay.
learn Russian. I only speak a token few words, but
Okay.
my understanding is they're still functioning. But yeah, outlets like RT have been, you know, I've received a number of messages from friends in Canada that they can't access RT on Telegram.
Yeah.
And RT in Europe, I think, has been fully shut down.
Yeah.
So
It's
there's a lot of,
difficult.
and in America as well, I believe.
Yeah. It's difficult to pick it up. I do follow Ashvin Ratansi, I think, if I've pronounced his name properly, who presents
Yes.
Going Underground. A fascinating, I mean, a journalist who's been with CNN, Al Jazeera, BBC, and exceptional journalist. And they have several others who it's a great shame switched off now. Eva?
You know, and I would just say about him, like he and actually RT in general, like I don't agree with everything RT puts out. I have to say that
Yeah,
I contribute to RT
yeah,
op-ed section. But I will say that they're actually more middle ground and balanced than Western media.
yeah,
And in fact, sometimes to the detriment. Sometimes I think like that's way too balanced. You know, like why? So you know, people say Russian propaganda, but they actually offer a much more balanced perspective.
yeah. I'm thinking people who criticize RT in the UK probably have not watched it. I've watched it on and off compared. I tend to watch a lot of different media because of the work I do, and you know, what struck me with RT and some of the programs, it reminds me of what the BBC used to be maybe 15, 20 years ago, where you would have a panel of quite critical journalists and panel, you know, you'd have a spread of opinion, whereas on the BBC, Sky News and others, it's very much, you know, a blanket, one opinion,
Yeah.
propaganda type media, which is quite disturbing that young people are growing up thinking this is the norm, which it certainly isn't. Eva, we're going to come to the end here. Final question, almost. Are we looking at the beginning of a new Cold War, or has the new Cold War already begun?
That I can't say. I really I don't do predictions. I don't
No,
know.
no.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Keep it there. Eva, you're probably too modest to mention it, but you've received some awards for your work. In 2017, the International Journalism Award for International Reporting, granted by the Mexican Journalists Press Club. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was a really nice surprise. They flew me
Okay.
to Mexico and gave me an award. And
Wow.
uh, Thierry Meyssan was another recipient that year. So
Okay.
it was quite an honor.
Wow. Okay. And you were the very first recipient, I understand, of the Serena Shim Award for uncompromised integrity in journalism.
Yeah,
Uh,
and that is also an honor because Serena Shim is no longer with us. She was
no.
an incredibly courageous journalist of Lebanese American descent, or she was an American of Lebanese descent. And she was doing courageous reporting from within Turkey on the border with Syria,
Yes.
exposing how terrorists were being funneled into Syria via, I forget which organization, was it World Food Program? And she did an interview on Press TV. I believe this was 2016. I'm very sorry if I'm getting the year wrong. It might have been 2015, saying she feared for her life, that Turkish intelligence were threatening her, and a day or two later she was dead.
Yes.
So it's and of course, whereas her family fought for an investigation and justice into her death,
Mm.
that never happened.
Yes.
So her death remains an unsolved mystery, but it's almost certain that it was Turkish intelligence,
Wow.
because she was exposing their involvement in terrorism in Syria. So
Okay.
yeah, to receive that award is very much an honor. Yeah.
Eva, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. Very, very interesting, and good luck with your journalism.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on.